Good afternoon. It's March the 4th, 1999. I'm Mayo Livingston, and this afternoon Tom Bush and I from the Southwest Georgia Regional Library are interviewing Rowland Bolton with his experiences from World War II. Rowland, tell us about how you enlisted and where you were in 1942, which was the big show, and why you decided to go in the Air Corps.
Well, first let me say this. I graduated from the University of Michigan in 1938, and I had been traveling 4 years for the Washington National Insurance Company in southeastern United States. During this time, the hostilities in Europe gradually grew worse and worse, and as a lot of you will remember, in July of '42, the Germans attacked Russia, headed for Moscow. So things were getting extremely serious, and the draft board was, after all, bachelors, and I was an eligible bachelor, age 26, fast approaching the age where I'd be too old to get in the Air Corps where I wanted to be. So in September, when I was still age 26, 1942, I enlisted in Gainesville, Florida, and I wasn't called to active duty until March 1943. I was asked to report in Jacksonville, Florida, which I did, and I, a bunch of others about my age, were put on a train, shipped to Chicago to Fool the Enemy, and then from Chicago back to San Antonio for classification center. For those of you who are not familiar with the war and the preparation for it, during this period of time, large numbers of young men are being trained rapidly so that we can protect the shores of this country from the enemy. And part of the movements was the training of men from the Air Force. They gathered them together in classification centers where they were examined physically and mentally and cataloged as to what job they would do best. I had asked to be a pilot, but one difficulty with my eyes prevented that, and I was classified as a navigator and was sent to everything in the Army. You're told what to do. You don't ask somebody, you get orders. I received orders to report at Ellington Field for pre-flight training and navigation. Spent 12 weeks there. Then
Where was Ellington Field?
That was in Houston, Texas. From there, I went to advanced navigation in San Marcos, Texas. And one interesting thing about it, it was a 26-week course, during which time we were to do 4 years work, 4 years normal academic work to become graduate navigators. The people in charge of the school down there decided that was too long. So we went to school from 8 o'clock in the morning until 8 in the evening, 7 days a week. I forgot how long that went on, but it went on. We didn't get any time off or anything until they finally realized that we'd cut several weeks off the end of the course. So they started letting us have a little liberty on the weekend. But I found out one thing at that time, that if there was ever anything that needed overhauling, and not by politicians, just our educational system, we learned in about 20 weeks, what takes 4 years. And that's all we'll say about that. I left navigation as an officer, and then I received orders to go to Roswell, New Mexico, where I went through bombardier school, and it was dual-rated bombardier navigator. And from there, I received orders to go to Clovis, New Mexico, which was only about 60, 70, 80 miles north east of Roswell. which was a replacement center for B-29 crews. When I got there was one B-29. There were quite a few officers.
And what year was this? When was this?
Well, we'd taken about a year in preparation, so we shot 1943. This was the beginning of 1944. This was in January of 44. I went to Clovis, New Mexico. And I said they had one B-29 there. Let's just say a word about the B-29. You kind of watch the clock run over time. But B-29 was a great mechanical step forward in aviation. First, it was the first pressurized bomber. By that I meant we didn't have to wear oxygen mask inside the plane if we didn't want to, because it was pressurized at 10,000 feet. The next thing, we didn't have any guns fired manually. We had a computer on board that fired the guns by remote control. They were in turrets, and the bombardier was CFC man, Central Fire Control. He could control all the turrets at one time if he wanted to. But normally he didn't do that. Normally the bombardier would control the forward guns, which were two turrets of 650 calibers. And then the other guns, there were 5 more guns, 50 calibers in the rear that were handled by gunners back there. The incident aiming was done through a rheostat. A rheostat was a simple little device in front of the gunner, and he looked through that, and all he had to do was have the exterior of a circle, a reticle circle, around the wing tips of the approaching airplane. And after that had been there 3 seconds, the computer had locked in the speed of the coming plane, the direction, the altitude, and all that stuff, and you hit the button, and that scratched number 1 enemy.
You were trained then also as a gunner.
Oh yes, the bombardier, see you were assigned to a crew. You may fly on a crew as a bombardier. Some of the missions I flew as bombardier, some I flew as navigator. And, but if you were flying as bombardier, you were in charge of the guns. You were Central Fire Control. Of course, that would be after the bombs had dropped, because before you dropped the bombs, all your attention and energies and so forth were directed toward hammering the bomb site and putting the bombs in the lap of the enemy.
You were trained with the famous Norden bomb site. Was it as good as we've always read to believe, Rowland?
Well, I tell you what I started to do at Bombardier School. One of the boys was teasing us, and I said, well, if you'll get out there on a bombing range, I'll put a bottle of scotch in your hip pocket at 12,000 feet.
It was good.
It was really a dead-eye dick at 12,000. Of course, when you got to high altitudes, the problem you ran into was really not the bomb site, but the fact that the gyros, which required electricity to stand up and be efficient, the gyros didn't get enough current at high altitudes for them to perform correctly. And the whole thing is trigonometry, just a triangle, figuring out your drop angle, and they weren't quite as accurate at high altitudes. So that's one of the reasons why most of the missions were flown at 18,000 or under.
Well,
let's say a word about one more word about
sure.
about B-29. The B-29 was not only pressurized and had these turrets, Central Fire Control, but it was a very large plane compared to the B-17. It was the wingspan was 141 feet. That's about half the length of a football field. That's the wings, the length across the wing. from front to tip was 99 feet. From the ground to the top of the plane was 27 feet 8 inches. And the theoretical takeoff weight was 140,000 pounds. Now, you'd never get an officer or an instrument in a B-29 if he knew it had that much in it, because that was a theoretical book, number that the engineers put in the book that designed the plane, but they didn't have to fly it. The flight engineers didn't want the planes to try to get off the ground with over 128,500 pounds. That's everything, gasoline, folks, and all. So it usually took off at between 125 and 128,000 pounds.
Was that total, was that the total weight? That was
That's
gasoline
and
what was the weight of the bombs?
Well, of course, the weight of the bombs, you could carry maximum load on a short mission, 20,000 pounds. But
20,000 pounds?
20,000 pounds, right, of bombs. Did I say pounds?
Yeah.
Well, let's see.
Well, that would be 10 tons.
That's right, that's right. Because normally, on short missions, we could take a full load. When we went to Osaka, which was, I remember Osaka was a very, very dangerous target. They had 800 guns up there. And the bombs we took weighed 4,000 pounds apiece. And I remember we just took two. Just took two. Maybe because, it was because of the distance and also the weight too. But it depended on the distance to the target. Well, we gotten away from what we was trying to follow here.
When you left New Mexico, you were.
I left Clovis when they finally got together a replacement crew and gave us orders for the crew to go to Kearney, Nebraska and get an airplane. That was staging base. Staging base is a place from which planes departed to go overseas in combat. And so we went up there and we were given a plane and finally checked it out. And we flew from Clovis to West Palm Beach, Florida.
You mean from Kearney?
Yeah.
You flew from Kearney to West
Palm Beach.
Palm.
Nebraska, right.
Yeah.
From Kearney, Nebraska to West Palm Beach. From West Palm Beach, we flew to British Guiana. There's a field down there cut out of the jungle called Atchison Field. Stayed there overnight and flew to Natal, Brazil. We stayed in Natal, Brazil 2 weeks because we were in the southern hemisphere and they've got a whole set of new stars down there. We were trained in the northern hemisphere, knew all the stars, what we call navigational stars. We don't memorize all 5,000 of them that you can see, just the navigational stars. And we had to memorize those. We laid out on our backs all night, every night, memorizing those things. Finally, we got where we knew them. We flew across the Atlantic to Accra, Africa.
Were you solo? I mean, did you have other planes with you?
No, that's another thing about the B-29. It was alone. Very few missions were flown in formation. Almost all, even if we're going over, of course, it was a single thing. Well, you take off at night. You see, the whole thing was designed for what we call astro navigation. You use the celestial, the stars, for navigation. You get out of, we were being trained for the Pacific. Ain't no landmarks over the ocean, you know. You're flying over the water most of the time. So you've got to have something to determine your position. And we didn't have satellites in those days. The only satellites we had were put up there by the Almighty. So we would shoot fixes with our sextant and plot it on the chart. And that's the way we determined, and that's why it was necessary to fly at night, and also it was the most practical thing to do. But we flew across I had mentioned the Mayo before. When we left Natal, Brazil, it was right at sundown, it was dark. And since when you when you get ready to depart an airplane, it ain't like getting in the car to go downtown. You have a chart and you lay a course line with your ruler all the way from departure point to destination. Then you measure that in degrees to find out what your heading is. You apply to that your drift and deviation. Well, before we left Natal, the weather department, we call it Metro, gave us a wind. We call it a Metro wind. It was a wind that the weather people thought we would be faced with that night, which they thought was going to be a they thought it was going to be a north wind. They thought it was going to be a north wind which would blow us south of course. You can see that. So you crab to the north, let's say 2 degrees. You crab, say, 2 degrees to the north and give your pilot the heading so that actually you'll be flying like this, but you'll be on course all the way. Well, after we'd been out for a while, I'd plotted a couple of fixes through the nose, and the navigator called me and said, "Did I see you plotting a fix?" I said, "Yeah, but they're no good." He said, "What do you mean they're no good?" I said, the refraction from the glass in the nose had thrown the figures off. He said, "Let me see it." He came up and he said, "Look at mine." His fell right along a straight line with mine, which meant that we had been given a reciprocal wind by meteorology. Instead of the wind from the north, it's from the south. So we, at the time we determined where we were 75 miles north of course. So we gave the pilot necessary correction, got back on course. But that was one of the interesting things that pointed up the accuracy and the necessity of having good sextants and having good knowledge of the navigational stars, because, see, the flights would take all night, When we'd fly up to Japan, we'd leave at 11 o'clock at night and get up there about 7 o'clock the next morning. And so this trip across the Natal, that was an all-night thing. We got from Natal to Accra. From Accra, we flew to Kano, Africa. Kano, we flew to Khartoum. Khartoum to Karachi, India. From Karachi to Chukulia, India, which is 100 miles north of Calcutta in the jungles.
Where is Kano, Africa?
Kano
Right
is really a village that's about 400 miles or 500 miles due north of Accra. And it was really just a short hop across there to refuel, because there was a straight shot going from west to east to go to Khartoum. And which is our next stop.
From Khartoum to Karachi, and Karachi to, how do you say that?
Chukulia.
Chukulia.
Yeah.
And you were stationed there for a while. Okay.
Yeah, we got there, it was in October of 44, and we stayed there until April of 45. And while there, I flew some missions. Most of the missions I flew, well, all the missions I flew were either to the Malayan Peninsula, Rangoon, Bangkok, and Singapore. But, of course, I didn't fly every mission. Some of the missions at that time were flown out of Chengdu, which was a staging base up in China. And I wasn't called on to fly, but from Chengdu we could bomb Japan direct, even when we were operating out of India.
Well, that's a CBI area, China, Burma, India, which we don't hear much about. But you were there, and it was your job primarily as the American Air Corps to bomb these Japanese where they had occupied Singapore. Did you bomb mostly you tried to pick out military installations?
Well, yes, we did. I remember Bangkok, one of the favorite things in Bangkok was a bridge across the river there. You see there was a road over there, I forgot the name of that road, that the Chinese used to, I mean, the Japanese used to take all supplies back and forth to their troops. And any bridges that would be part of that road system, we would bomb. And there was a big one in Bangkok. Another thing was a rail yard. We bombed the rail yard so that they couldn't move stuff by rail.
And you went from there up to, you moved from there up to China, Chintu, say,
Well, no, if you were bombing Japan direct, then the supplies had been ferried up there by C-46 and C-47. And then when the B-29s were ready, they'd fly up there, they'd load up and fly a direct mission against the Japanese mainland.
Well, is this when you put your crew together, or did you have your crew coming over?
When we arrived in India, our crew was broken up because we were just a replacement crew. They took the pilot and co-pilot, put them on C-46s to haul supplies over the hump. And we sat around until some boys were rotated back to the States and we took their places. But each of us was assigned a permanent crew at that time. And mine, the pilot at that time, was Fountain Brown. And he's still in the Air Force, by the way. He's a brigadier general, I think, now. But we stayed with that same crew until, my recollection is, until we went to Tinian. And after we flew to Tinian, after the Marianas, which is a string of islands in the Pacific, were taken by the Marines, and all those islands were changed into air bases for the B-29. We flew over there, the crews were reassigned, and I was put on another crew.
How many was in a crew on a B-29?
11. You had, up front you had the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer. But you also had one enlisted man, he was a radio operator. That was the front. That back in the back were gunners.
You had, but the only gun, and they didn't have the only guns that, all the guns up front were operated by computers, on what you said.
Well, all the guns were operated by computers.
Even those in the back?
Oh yeah, we could control those, but we usually released those to the gunners, except under unusual circumstances. In other words, they were used primarily to protect attacks from the rear, and the gunners could see planes coming from the rear better than we could up front. And the two forward turrets were controlled by the bombardier and used more frequently than anything else by the bombardier.
Well, what was the range of the B-29? It must have been about 1,000 miles.
Well, no, it was 4,000 miles plus. See, it was 4,000 miles to Singapore and back.
Oh.
So the missions took between 20 and 22 hours, non-stop. There was no gas stations.
Even going from India down, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Down to the...
We'd leave at 11 o'clock at night. We'd get back between 6 and 8 o'clock the next night.
And usually you went solo. I mean, or maybe several planes.
Never went anyway in that area in formation. Never. It was always single planes.
And you went from there to Tinian, and where you were involved with bombing the Japanese homeland from about April.
Even there, you see, it was an organized attack, as they called them, 1,000-plane raids. It was organized so that the planes, while flying individually, were spaced on takeoff so that they wouldn't run into each other in route. And there'd be, for example, there'd be planes over the target maybe all day, or maybe 2 days running to get them all on there and drop all the eggs.
What did
Singly.
Well, we've often heard of the famous fire raids, dropping incendiary bombs. Did you all carry all explosives, or was some of yours the fire bombs?
When I say most, I would say 90% of the bombs we dropped were fire bombs. They burned at 4,000 degrees. You drop them, they burn through concrete. In other words, no matter what kind of roof they had, it go right on through to the basement. Didn't have to worry about them setting something on fire.
What, you said that Osaka was one town that was well covered with flak. I mean, you had plenty of it. Was flak the biggest problem you had, or was the Japanese Air Force still?
The Japanese Air Force was very efficient, and they were a constant problem. We're thankful they weren't more numerous. But the planes were very efficient. They got up to our altitude, they operated very efficiently at our altitude. And Osaka, I mentioned that in our previous discussion, had about 800 anti-aircraft guns. And they were trying to protect the Shimamoto Metal Works up there. They had 12-foot thick masonry walls, 12 feet thick, trying to protect this factory. That's why we took the 4,000-pound bombs. And we did fly that in day formation and all bombed on the lead plane. That means when the bombs from the lead plane leave, everybody would salvo. So you've got all those bombs from the formation, 12 planes. 12 planes, all bombs hit at one time. Well, when we looked at the pictures after it was all over, the first picture showed the bombs in flight. The second picture showed nothing but dust. But you could see that in some spots you could see the walls were vibrating, just like they were made out of paper. It's a 12-footer. And then the last picture, they were flat.
You know, but you only carried two, each plane had two of those bombs.
Two of those bombs, that's right.
Were you ever escorted?
No, we never did have any, we didn't have any escorts. There was some planes that were stationed offshore somewhere to send help for planes that would crash going back home, that would be damaged by anti-aircraft or something over the target, and it'd be a difficulty. And these other planes, they weren't really fighter type planes. They were planes just for sea rescue, air-sea rescue planes would be flying off the coast to get help if we needed it. Another thing I forgot to mention about Osaka that was unusual, we were bombed by Japanese planes when we were bombing Osaka. They were flying over us, dropping phosphorus bombs that would explode in the formation. Real eerie.
Would that take out some of your planes, some of our planes? If it hit one, it'd happen.
Oh gosh, yes, you know, phosphorus. It burns through anything.
Well, you and I talked about it the other day. It's interesting because the statistics claim that there were very few losses over Tokyo or over Osaka. And you said, yeah, that y'all got back out of there. And then that's when they was not over the losses. A lot of the planes made it. They were halfway to Iwo Jima.
What they called a combat loss was a loss of a plane that went down over the target. And if a plane was damaged over the target and fell a mile outside the target area, that was operational loss. It wasn't a combat loss. You know, that's what you get back to the definitions, you know. And playing with words, you never could really know what your losses were until you knew how many planes left and how many came back. That was the bottom line that the boys looked at. We didn't look at these legal definitions.
But did you ever land at Iwo Jima, or did any?
Yeah, we landed
you did?
over there. Yeah, we landed over there, and it was the strangest place I've ever seen. The ground you know, it's just a big volcano that they smoothed out. The ground had so much sulfur in it, it was smoking all the time, smoking, just like it was on fire. Smelled good, man, you know how sulfur smells.
Well, what was your purpose on that? Were you hit?
We were damaged in some way, that's why.
In other words, your plane did get some flak damage?
Oh, yeah, everybody got some flak damage. We had a serious accident over to Singapore. We were hit in the wing direct and blew a hole in the right wing 6 feet in diameter. But fortunately, the bomb exploded at such a point where it wasn't close enough to main wing spars to weaken the angle of the wing. So the wing stayed on there, lost an engine right there, as I remember. But that was one of the missions. It took about 24 hours to get back because we had to feather that engine. We couldn't draw full power on the other engines because we were afraid we'd lose them, you know, if we taxed them too much.
You had 4 engines on a B-29.
Yeah.
Just like a B-17.
422, no, they were 4,200 horsepower engines. They're much stronger. I think later they jacked them up to 25, but in the beginning they were 2,200 horsepower each.
And I believe you said you bombed Hiroshima.
Yes, I was in, we flew around the clock against Japan once we got to Tinian. And one of the cities that I bombed was Hiroshima. That was, of course, before the atom bomb was dropped on it. And I remember it because there's a Navy ship, capital ship in there, refueling or something. The Navy, the Japanese Navy were good shots. And they would put the flak mighty close to us. And we were glad to get out of there with our skins. Yeah, we bombed our favorite target, of course, was Tokyo. One of the interesting things about that, I guess I should have mentioned it, is that one of the missions, we flew in at 10,000 feet. Well, that's kind of low. You know, of course, it was at night, but at 10,000 feet, we were dropping firebombs. Well, everybody was dropping on the flames, the previous planes, because they kept spreading and spreading. It burned up, I don't know how much of Tokyo. But when we dropped the bombs, by the time we dropped the bombs, you know, we were indicating, because we were so low, we were indicating 250. We normally would be indicating about 200.
200 what?
250 miles an hour.
Okay.
That was a cruising speed at the time we went in over the top. We got it up to 250 because we were so low. Well, when we hit, later we found out we had a 250 mile an hour ground wind, tailwind. So our ground speed was actually 500 miles an hour. We laughed about the Japs, wondering where those big bombers got so much speed, because they didn't know about the tailwind. But anyway, when we hit this updraft from this fire, within a matter of 5 seconds, we were wafted to 21,000 feet. We went 11,000 feet in about 5 seconds. I ain't joking. You're talking about pandemonium.
Well, let me ask you this now. When you were flying at night, we didn't have radar. They didn't have radar. When they still put up a pretty good flak shield up there, they had searchlights.
Yes, sir.
And
we had all that stuff. We'd throw tinfoil out the back and all that stuff, trying to distract them, you know. But they had the ways of tracking them.
The Enola Gay, flew off the Tinian. Did you know it was there, or did you know anything about what was going on?
No, there were 2 airfields on Tinian, North Field, South Field, and not much to our surprise, after the atom bomb was dropped, we found that they were stationed at North Field. And it's real quiet. They kept a real secret on that thing. And none of the boys knew they were up there. And of course, we were all jubilant when we heard they'd dropped the atom bomb and said the war's over, the war's over, we'll go down to the office club and get drunk. And so the commanding officer got us all together, said, I got some bad news. We didn't have but one bomb. Of course, we found out later that wasn't true. We didn't have about 2 or 3 at that time. But it did take a second one, as you know, to bring the Japs to their knees.
After the bombs were dropped, did you all have any more missions over Tokyo? I believe you told me it's interesting you got over there one time, and the last one you found out the war was over.
No, we were on the way up. It wasn't to Tokyo, it was to one of the cities, one of the islands. It happened to be an oil terminal, and we got the message on the radio that the war was over. The pilot asked the crew, said, what do y'all want to do? And the crew said, why waste all that gasoline coming up here if we don't do something? So we went ahead and delivered the bombs.
And the war was over.
You know, stealing a Japanese term, by golly, so solid.
Well, then, after the war was over in August, you returned back and you came back home, and how long did it take you?
The return trip home, I flew back as navigator, and I navigated all the way from Tinian back to San Francisco. And first to Kwajalein Island, and from Kwajalein Island we flew to Diamond Head in the Hawaiian Islands, and from there to Mesa Field in San Francisco. And I'll be frank with you, I was one happy boy, and so were all the rest of us, to get back home. If you've never been 10,000 miles from home, you need to try it just one time. That's a long way.
Well, did you have any idea of what your mission would be before we close out, or what your mission might have been had we had to invade Japan? Were you all going to continue just to pound the Japanese?
Oh yes, the high command running the show there were committed to ultimate and complete surrender of the Japanese. Now, if we hadn't dropped the atom bomb, it would have been a very, very bloody thing because of our experience with them on the islands. We had to get them out of holes and out of tree trunks and all kinds of places. They'd fight down to the last man. They wouldn't surrender like an army. They'd fight as individuals. And so the estimate was that we would have lost at least 1 million men. We had 1 million casualties, rather. If we had insisted on having to do even though we would have pounded them and burned them and done all that stuff, well, you take all those islands, Mile Ends of battleships, our battleships would pull up there and pound those islands till you'd think there wasn't anything left on there, even a mosquito. And yet when we'd land, the Japs would come out of these holes like rats, and it'd still be a terrific fight. And that's what would have happened in the home. We'd gone up there.
Rowland, this has been real interesting, and we appreciate you taking your time to sharing these thoughts with us. Have you got anything else you'd like to close out with?
Well, the only thing that I can say is that people forget, and they have a tendency to follow in the footsteps of their fathers and make the same mistakes by forgetting that we should always be prepared, like the Boy Scouts. A nation should always be prepared, especially a nation like the United States. With what we have, we need to make sure we have adequate defenses at all times, because last time, one of the sayings that was very popular the time World War II started, was too little and too late. We found out at Pearl Harbor, we found out a number of other places. And that's one thing we don't want to do again, but there's one Democrat, there's one party in the United States that always wants to say, it's all over, there's nothing to worry about. Well, when everybody says there's nothing to worry about, that's the time to start worrying.
That's the time to get worried. We appreciate this afternoon, and we appreciate your advice, and I think most of us in this generation are going to listen. In particular, we study. And that concludes our interview for this afternoon.